Everyone, we're going to just give everyone a moment to filter in. All right, while everyone's filtering in, I'll just get us started. We are in a webinar feature today, the Zoom webinar room. So we won't see you or hear you in the audience, but we do please ask you to participate by entering any questions you have in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you shake your mouse, you'll see that chat bubble there. So please feel free to ask any questions you have for Cal there. I'm Erin Driscoll at the Wilmington Memorial Library, and I want to thank our neighboring libraries in Billerica, Tewksbury, Chelmsford, Andover, and North Reading for helping us to promote this event this morning. I'm so excited to introduce Cal Flyn. Cal is an award-winning writer from the Highlands of Scotland. Her first book, Thicker Than Water, was a Times Book of the Year, and her journalistic writing has been published in Granada, the Sunday Times Magazine, Telegraph Magazine, The Economist, amongst others. She's a columnist for Prospect and the deputy editor of the literary recommendation site 5 Books. She's also a regular contributor to The Guardian. Cal has been the writer-in-residence at Gladstone Libraries and the Jan Michalski Foundation in Switzerland. She was made a MacDowell Fellow in 2019. I'm gonna turn it over to Cal. So Cal, Islands of Abandonment, can you give us a bit of an idea of the concept behind your new book?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. So Islands of Abandonment, it's a nonfiction book. And I've been thinking of it almost as like a weird nature book. So it's got 13 different locations around the world, all of which have been abandoned for a number of decades. And I go to each of them in person, partly to sort of soak up the atmosphere in these places, and partly to sort of study how nature is rebounding in these places, or also how they make us feel. So I'm interested in the ecology and the psychology of abandoned places.
Excellent. How did you select the places that you ended up visiting?
It was pretty difficult actually, because I went on, once you start noticing these abandoned places, you realize that they're all around you. And I was interested in all different sizes of them. So from very small places, so that might just be like a single abandoned car park, and, how the plants and animals might sort of reclaim it over time. And then that goes all the way up to, the enormous Chernobyl exclusion zone, and, the size really of a small country. And that contains like 200 villages and 2 towns, and that's been abandoned now since the 1980s or 1986 when the meltdown happened. So really picking them was difficult, and I suppose my reasoning for choosing each of these places was that they should all have a story, not only that was interesting in itself, but it told us something more. So for example, I went to a series of we call them bings in Scotland, but they're sort of like shale mountains. You might call them slag heaps, I think, in the US. And those are very large landmarks in a particular area in Scotland where I am, but they've been sort of taken over by vegetation and so on. So I looked at those places because I wanted to look at the idea of ecological succession, which is how, you start with certain weeds and then grasses, and then maybe they will turn into bushes and later into trees. This kind of model of how recolonization by plants works. So that was one. And then I wanted to look at, for example, the question of invasive species, which are mainly due to human activities, and what happens if we stop sort of moving things around and trying to control the species around us. So I went to an abandoned botanical garden in Tanzania. So each of these places, I suppose, is somehow emblematic of a bigger question about, the ecology of these places. Oh, I think you're muted. I'm sorry.
You are right, I was. I was saying, you also talk in your book about kind of the aesthetics of these places and kind of the beauty of abandonment. Why do you think we're drawn to those aesthetics? Those of us that are drawn to them.
Yeah, that's such a great way of putting it, actually, because I think not everybody is, but a lot of people are. They find these places very somehow like emotionally salient or significant for some reason. And I think partly there's this sort of eeriness to an abandoned place. It hits like I've come to think of it as hitting like an uncanny valley. So it's somewhere between like a lived-in house and a complete ruin, maybe like grown over with grass. Those two extremes on the spectrum are not scary to us or frightening to us in the same way, but there's somewhere in the middle when it's like a human habitation but not quite. They feel that some kind of important element has dropped out when it's abandoned, and it's been abandoned for a certain amount of time before it turns into a ruin. I think it really does hit something, and I think it frightens people, but in an intriguing way. We're curious about what's happened. You get the sense of there having been a story and you not necessarily knowing what it is, and you also get that sense of other species sort of beginning to reclaim the space, or moving through the space unseen. And so these places are very, I don't know, they're very moving, I think, to visit. So I was interested not only in isolated abandoned spots, but also in abandoned places within, say, cities. So I went to Detroit to look at the phenomenon that there they call blight, but I also went to Paterson in New Jersey to look at large areas of industrial ruins, which are right at the heart of the city. And part of this was to ask that question of, what is abandonment if there are still people there? That these places are certainly abandoned, these particular buildings, but if they're still being lived in, what does abandoned mean? So it sort of spiraled out from there. And I found that it's so much tied up with our psychology, our feelings of place, and how we feel when we're there. So we have these like polarized responses to abandoned places. Some of us find them really thrilling, and that's where you find these urban explorers. So they'll go out and they take these amazing sort of very aestheticized images of abandoned places, often with that single figure, in a big, almost like a landscape, but that might be a big hall in a hotel or a big turbine hall, something like that. And so you're quite used to seeing those very beautiful images. And then there's the other side, which I suppose it's tied up with quite dark elements of the human personality. So destructive elements, people go there to break things or to break the rules in some way. Often these places do become, I don't know, sort of hotbeds of crime because they are some unpoliced structure. And I think that's that feeling of getting, I don't know, beneath the skin of the human condition a little bit. You start to see like really raw elements of human behavior in abandoned places, and I find that extremely interesting.
Yes. Did you travel alone to most of these places?
Quite a few of them actually. The one that sort of impacted me the most was where I was most alone. And it's a small island called Swona. It's off the north coast of Scotland, and it was abandoned in the end of the 1970s. It was an old brother and sister, actually, who were the last people to live on this island. And I went there because I was initially interested in looking at their cattle. So they had a small herd of cows that they kept, and very handled cows. They were used to being led around and milked and so on. But then when they left due to old age, this brother and sister left the cattle on the island with the expectation that family members would go back and get them later on. And for one reason or another, the cattle were never removed, and they've been living there essentially wild ever since. And so it's like this feral herd of cows. So I was interested in those to begin with, but actually what became most sort of pressing about the place when I got there, I got dropped off alone by a boatman, and I spent 24 hours there on my own. And that, I guess it's an extreme solitude of being genuinely the only person on the island, and being surrounded by the very visible absence of people. These broken down old houses, often with old belongings, copies of magazines that had been there since the 1970s. I found that it really got into my head. So I found it difficult to sleep, and I didn't want to eat, and I really sort of swung to really extreme emotions, and so that caught me off guard. So that's where I was most alone. And then quite a few of the other places I went alone, mainly for logistical reasons, and maybe I would meet people in them. So in Paterson, New Jersey, I actually met a guy who's a local urban explorer of some renown called Wheeler and Benaz, and he became a really good friend. And then we met some more people that sort of hung out in the ruins and were mainly there to smoke drugs, actually. And so we were just like, what brought you here? And this guy, it was like he was waiting for us to tell us his life story. You know, it just all came tumbling out. And yeah, so I don't know. I think that's one of the things that really surprised me, was that often there are people in these abandoned places and they've always got such interesting stories and you just can't anticipate them. So often I'd go places expecting to bang into people and to find out why they were there.
Yes, yeah, and we should say your book is sort of a, you know, you have a lot of sections of memoir, but also interviews with the people remaining in these places, and also, you know, some hard facts and data around ecology and our impact on these places. It's quite a fascinating mix.
Yeah, I think it was important to me that it's very much in the first person. So, you know, I went here and I met this and so on, but to try and give background as well, partly because I think understanding the factual context of these places helps you understand your emotional response to them as well.
Sure. Did you have to do any, I guess, sort of like preparation for some of the places you were going? Like any kind of, I don't know, like survival training, or like, you know, some of the places you go, there are elements that are quite dangerous for your body, like Chernobyl or anything like that. How did you prepare, I guess, to go to these different locations?
I suppose quite often the preparation was in the logistics of getting there would tended to be the most preparation that was involved. So in Chernobyl, it's actually surprisingly easy for someone to visit Chernobyl. I mean, even tourists can do it if they want. You know, you can book onto a tour or something, but you do need to go with your, you know, your passport, and you need to find a translator and a guide to take you in. It is relatively easy. And then, so I traveled with a driver and a translator. And as we came in, you have to pass through these very Soviet era sort of scanners. It's a bit like a, you know, like a knife detector, like a metal detector, you know. So you go through these BP scanners dating from the 80s, and they're all very battleship gray and just seem incredibly untrustworthy. I don't know, it was very low tech. So you just walk through these scanners and then lights flash in completely confusing methods, and I'd be like, am I radioactive or should I stop? And people be like, no, just keep going. And then so we were given I carried a dosimeter which also acted as a Geiger counter in the moment, so it's telling you how much in real time radiation is sort of being hit by you, or particularly the counter. And then it also calculates what dose you have over a period. And unless you go to really extreme areas of contamination within the zone, because of the way that radiation or radioactive particles have been degrading over time, a large quantity of the radioactive material, due to the half-life, has sort of died off in terms of how radioactive it is, if that makes sense. So much of what we were most frightened of in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, one of the radioactive iodine was what was causing the most harm to humans. It gets lodged in the thyroid gland, is absorbed by the body, and then that causes all sorts of problems. It causes particularly thyroid cancer and leukemia. But that particular radioactive element has sort of died away. It's still there, but in attenuated form. And that happened to several of the other radioactive elements. So there is, you know, continues to be large amounts of radiation being emitted within the zone, but it tends to be in quite predictable areas now. So if you go as a visitor, you will probably be able to avoid them. I talk a little bit. I know I was going to do this later, but actually, shall I read a little section from the Chernobyl chapter, just because that's very relevant here?
Yes, I think that would be wonderful.
Okay, great. So this was kind of what I was talking about. So I'll just read a little bit longer than I planned, but then it will give you a sense. I step outside, descend a set of steps, and as I do, from nowhere, the dosimeter in my pocket raises its voice from the occasional background click to the crackle of white noise before overloading and sounding its warning alarm, a two-note siren of a timbre and pitch that seems intended to fluster. A jolt of adrenaline hits my system. What's happening? I blurt out, embarrassingly panicked, but unable to contain myself. The silence, the inodorousness, the invisibility of the danger preys on my mind. I'm blindfolded in a room of poisoned daggers. What's happening? Ludmilla waves my panic away. Hotspot, she says, and my fear evaporates with the label in the way a grave medical diagnosis might sometimes bring relief. She points to the bottom step. Liquidators returning from the reactor area kick the dirt from their boots and remove their clothes here before getting into minibuses that parked out front. These minibuses, too contaminated to save, would later be buried in vast mass graves lined with concrete. The dust they left behind has left a radioactive trace which persists into the present. I hold my dosimeter over what seems to be the hotspot's epicenter, a concrete slab shrouded in leaf mold, and watch the numbers climbing. It stops at 1582 microsieverts an hour, around 100 times the background dose. Ludmilla thrusts her hand out over mine. The dosimeter in her grip is bigger and more professional looking. His reading is different, higher. It likes cesium, she shrugs, and though I don't understand, I feel myself jealous. Can I hold it? I ask, and I take the wailing device. When I step away, it falls silent. I relax. The sky is white cloud, too bright to look at. The air is still. I follow the steps down to the cafe's private jetty, from which I look out across a smooth curve of ice that lids the lake's surface, one that does not break when I drop a rock onto it. And what I think about is this, how the past is imprinted upon the present, in every place, but never more tangibly than here. I navigate it blindly in the present, with dosimeter as torch.
Excellent. Yes, that gives us a good sense of the tone of the book in your writing, Cal. We have our first question from the audience, and please, audience members, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in. Teresa would like to know, how did you find out about these places? And are there any places you visited that didn't make the book, or any places you wanted to visit but weren't able to?
Yes, great. So mainly, how did I find out about these places? So it was a mix of just finding them online. I mean, there is this sort of subculture online that's very almost like obsessed with abandoned places. You get these sort of trip reports where urban explorers go into places and they take photos and they say exactly how they got in and, you know, is it safe and all of this kind of thing. So there is a lot of information out there online, although you never really know how up to date it is. And there were quite a few places, particularly in this country, where I just thought I could down tools and sort of dash over. You know, the international travel I wanted to be a bit more certain about before I turned up, but at home I would just sort of dash out and try and get in places. So sometimes online, sometimes just from interesting conversations with people, and also some from scientific papers. So what was important to me, I sort of touched on this earlier, was that these places should not just, I didn't want to just have a sort of litany of places and the stories of how they fell apart, because I felt that would be quite repetitive. So what I wanted was that for them to be, somehow sort of symbolic of a wider aspect or story. So when I was researching certain types of contemporary ecology of this is a really interesting area of science at the moment, this sort of human impacted landscapes. So what we call brownfield sites, I think you do too. So these sort of derelict areas of land have always been sort of looked down on as wastelands, but actually in ecology right now, people are sort of realizing that they can be amazing for biodiversity, and specifically for invertebrate biodiversity. So, creepy crawlies, also reptiles, small reptiles, they love these places where there's bits of tarmac or concrete, and that's close to maybe puddles, deep puddles, and just bushes and shrubs and stuff. If all that stuff is really close together, it's what's called an open mosaic habitat. And so that's great for really tiny invertebrates, because they need all different things at different stages in their life. So we're beginning to understand that a lot of places that look untidy and messy and valueless are actually, from an ecological point of view, quite valuable. So from that, I knew that I needed to find a an abandoned place that had exactly that kind of habitat in it. And in the when I was looking at what's called novel ecosystems, which is the study of how invasive species sort of bed down in habitats, I knew that probably what I wanted to be looking at was abandoned botanical gardens, because they were such a source of invasive species during the colonial era. So I needed to find a colonial era botanical garden, and then I found two and sort of narrowed them down. So sometimes it starts sort of top up and you're looking for a place that fits a set of criteria, and other times it's the other way around. You find somewhere amazing and you can't quite figure out why it's so amazing, and that process is figuring out, you know, what the reason is to do it, if that makes sense. And yeah, there were loads of places that I would love to go and haven't, partly just because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these interesting places. I was very interested in, there's a town in Western Australia that was abandoned because it was asbestos mining area, and now it's believed that the sort of asbestos can hang around in the air and get in people's lungs, so it was sort of forcibly abandoned. But it's still, there's still a couple of people hanging on there who don't want to give up their homes in these areas, and you see that in a place like Centralia in Pennsylvania as well. You know, you have, that's the place where there is sort of essentially an underground fire in coal mines, and it's just burning very slowly. And people don't want to leave there as well. And I think that I find that very moving, the way that people are just so attached to home that even when it changes almost beyond comprehension, they don't want to leave and they don't want to give up on a place. And that was interesting. I was interested in going there, but actually I ended up asking those questions of a different place. And I would love to go to these abandoned mines in Svalbard, which are the islands just off the north coast of Norway. They were a big area of Soviet mining, in fact still kind of are, but the huge sort of mining towns have been completely abandoned, and also in South Georgia, which were whaling populations. But both of those places are very cold, and in colder ecosystems, in colder climates, it takes a lot longer for the for, I suppose, nature to come back. It just takes many more seasons because everything moves slowly. So those ones I didn't have so much interesting stuff to say about, so I decided not to go for those ones.
Sure. We have a question from Sandy. Do you think that any of these places are haunted?
That's a great question, because certainly these are places that frighten. And I found myself answering, like, I found myself sort of confronting whether or not I believed in this when I was alone on Swona, the island I was talking about earlier, because I was sleeping on my own in a house which hasn't been lived in since certainly the 70s, perhaps even a little bit before. And while I was walking around in the house, must have been 5 or 6 p.m. It wasn't really dark yet, but I heard the sound of somebody running very loudly, and it sounded very much like a human. And I just had this like terrible start that there was somebody in the building with me, and I was somehow stuck on this island, like completely isolated on this island with a person that I didn't know. And then when I tried to track down where that sound was coming from, it was very heavy footsteps and moving quite fast in a small house. I couldn't track it down, and I was completely stumped. And then I realized I was very frightened, but I realized that there was nothing in me that believed it to be a ghost. And that was interesting, because I don't know, I think I have kind of a mystical part of my personality, but something in me just didn't grasp it. And later I did manage to track it down, and it had been a bird nesting in the roof space, and I guess a very heavy bird that managed to make an enormous amount of noise, because it was sort of here in the eaves like this, and then I went hammering. I could hear it on the other side of the wood. So that was interesting, because I was a lot more, I don't know, braver than I thought I would be, and more cowardly in other ways. So I don't know. I think maybe I came to the conclusion that no, but there are qualitative things about these places that get under your skin, and you know, that I don't know what that is, and I think everyone can feel it, and I guess that's what I would say.
Yes, yeah, it's easy not to believe like during the day, I suppose, but once you're confronted at night in an abandoned place, I guess you really find out how you feel about it.
Oh, we've lost you again.
Another question we had in the chat is, what is the oldest place you visited? What would you think maybe, what was the longest abandoned?
Oh, great question. To some extent, maybe the botanical garden, because that was built in the, sorry, I'm just having a look at the pictures that I've got in front of me. No, that's not true. I went to quite a few places that have been abandoned since the early 20th century, but had been sort of previously abandoned before. So those were like fortress islands in the Firth of Forth, which are just outside of Edinburgh. So they've been sort of settled, unsettled, settled, unsettled, and so all the ruins are all of different ages. And then so the botanical garden was a little bit like that because it had been built by the German colonial forces, again, early 20th century, and then the laboratories had fallen from use, but then surrounding buildings were being used in different ways. I found that places that have been abandoned for much longer than that had fallen into that next state. They'd become sort of ruins, and yes, for some reason I didn't find they had the same emotional impact. They were very much of the past, whereas these were sort of somewhere in between past and present. So, for example, in the northeast of the US, I've spent some time in New England and walking what were essentially abandoned farms, but are now deep forest. So a lot of the beautiful autumnal foliage that you see there was once very intensively, well, for the time, intensively farmed farmland. But as farmers moved sort of more into the sort of breadbasket of the United States, and they left these farms because they were harder to run, and so they've all grown back. And so there are a lot of ruins that you can find just, I suppose, in the countryside in New England. So I suppose they're dating from often the later half of the 19th century, but from there I didn't have that sort of haunting, eerie sense that I got in other places. I felt like they'd almost passed the threshold into another type of place, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. I grew up in New Hampshire, so definitely used to, being in the woods and finding a lot of stone walls and kind of old like fruit cellars and things like that. Teresa, I would like to know, what places did you visit in the US? It sounds like you visited a few.
Yes, absolutely. So in the US, well, I went to Detroit to talk about, I suppose, urban abandonment, or that sort of tug. There I was interested in the way that people locally spoke about this idea of blight and how neighborhoods could be, that they would decline in population, but you might be able to sort of bring them back with concerted effort in some places. And like, what were people doing to try and avert the abandonment? So these were people who are sort of actively trying to stop abandonment in its tracks, if that makes sense. People who go out and cut the grass and make these abandoned houses look not abandoned, or they board them up or do something to make them less derelict. So I went to Detroit. I went to Paterson, New Jersey, where I was looking at the industrial heart of the city, which is, a lot of it is now sort of boarded off. Is actually quite full of a homeless population, actually, or people go there to take drugs, as I alluded to earlier. Very near there, I went to look basically at Newark Harbor, to look at the ghost ships there. There's a sort of ship graveyard. There's a number of them in Newark Harbor, and they were a sort of stand-in for my study of the long-standing pollution that's sort of sunk into the sediments at the bottom of Newark Harbor. So they were a sort of symbol of that, like what's been left behind from the industrial age. And then finally, I went to the Salton Sea in California. So I was interested in the shrinking man-made lake there. And then there are sort of settlements all around the Salton Sea, as it's called, and then also to Slab City, which is quite an anarchic encampment that's been built on an abandoned military base very close to the Salton Sea. So that's about 4 or 5 places in America. You'll need to.
So sorry. One question we have in the chat is, does vegetation return to these abandoned places, and what types of vegetation returns?
Short answer is yes, and the longer answer is so we find through a whole host of natural processes that vegetation returns often in quite a random way, but there is sort of a predictable number of stages that it takes, but the actual species can be a real mix. We have something called seed rain. It's got a simple idea, but I just think it's very poetic, which is all of these seeds, and not just seeds actually, but like tiny insects and like spiders, you know how they balloon? Things will get sort of swept up in the wind into that upper parts of the atmosphere, and they swirl around there. And then according to air currents, they'll sort of come back down and be dropped on land all around the world. So it's this great randomizing process. So if you have something like an abandoned piece of ground, or if you have sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have a brand new volcanic island, they kind of pop up out of the waves completely sterile. You can consider them as almost exactly the same thing, ecologically speaking. And then the seeds will sort of rain down in it randomly, or you'll have seabirds or whatever local birds are around, you know, dropping seeds out of their poo. Their droppings, that's the word I was looking for. And then you'll have things blowing in on the wind at a lower area. So you tend to get these like wildflowers quite early on. You'll get lichens and moss, they're very early, and then rough grasses. And those things tend to lay the groundwork for the other things. And also you get, depending on where you are in the world, really tough tree species start really early on. So things like birch, they start coming up. For example, if there's broken tarmac, they will come through the tiny cracks and then they'll like lever it apart. So they also start, you know, preparing the ground for other species as well. You get things like thorny shrubs, and they create almost like harbors, safe harbors for other species to come up inside them. So yes, you do see vegetation returning. What vegetation very much depends on where you are, what the ground's like where you are. So in a few of my sites, particularly a site that I went to in the Zone Rouge in France, which was along the front line in the First World War. This was an area that was very badly polluted with shell, shrapnel, actually human remains, which in some areas still remain, and particularly heavy metal pollution. So I went in an area where they burned a lot of chemical weapons at the end of the war, basically to stop them being used during armistice. And then that poisoned this whole area where they'd set fire to all these chemical weapons. And it was something like 17% of weight arsenic. And there's also lead in there and a bunch of other metals. And that's very difficult for most plants to live in, but not all. So I looked at hyperaccumulating metal plants and also metal tolerant plants and how those might go in and through their own action, either because they die and then other plants grow on top of them, or because they actually suck the pollutants out of the soil themselves and hold it in their own bodies, they start sort of preparing the ground for other more sort of generalist species to come in.
Excellent. What do you make of sort of the rewilding efforts we see in different parts of the world? I'm thinking of like places we've tried to reintroduce apex predators like wolves, or places we've tried to reforest. What do you make of those efforts?
I think it's really interesting, and I think that there's no like anything from my point of view, anything where we try and hand over more control can only really be a good thing. I guess I'm mainly interested in where this rewilding has happened or is happening mainly by itself, because I do think that it's wonderful that we are replanting forests, and it's wonderful that, you know, we want to return species that we have sort of pushed out. But I do think that nature is very capable of doing a lot of this itself. And so there's a very famous example of releasing the wolves at Yosemite and how that changed the browsing habits of deer. But actually another thing that impacted the same deer was the return of mountain lions, and they brought themselves back during the same period. So that's very interesting. And I think we have to think about what's the best use of our resources. Are the best use of our resources mainly to set more land aside? Or is there, so I think that's very much a case-by-case basis. I am really interested in rewilding. I think it is brilliant, and everyone who's doing it is definitely coming from the right place and is doing a good thing. And I think if we can extend our efforts by even being more passive, but over a larger area, then that, in my opinion, would be an even better thing.
And along those lines, we have a question from an attendee asking, what do you think will ultimately happen to Chernobyl? Is there any long-term plans that you know of for the area?
Yeah, that's a big question. And in fact, that's a big question of several of the places that I went to. I would suspect that it will remain some kind of reserve over time, because so many people around the world have found it moving to see the natural regeneration that's taking place there. And in Chernobyl, it has been quite remarkable. That's not to say that the continuing radioactive contamination does not do harm to those species that are returning. But at the moment, it seems to be the trade-off is that it does less harm to them. The harm it does to them doesn't stop them breeding. And hopefully those populations will just keep going and keep reclaiming. And then over time, there'll be less and less radiation to harm them. So we have seen, a return of wolves by themselves. There are a 7-fold increase of wolves. We saw bears return to the zone for the first time in over 150 years. A lot of species have been returning to the zone by themselves. And to some extent, it's self-selecting. So those species that can't do well in contaminated environments will die out. So especially things like pines, actually unexpectedly pine trees, they're not good at dealing with radiation. They don't do well. They tend to mutate, and you get these weird sort of weakling trees. But what do well are things like silver birch, and they have popped up in their place. So what was called the red forest. So this is an aerial forest very close to the nuclear plant where there was a meltdown, in the direction of where all the nuclear dust blew. That all died off, and there was this huge dead forest for a long time. And actually what's come back in that area, which is still very contaminated, is mainly birch. So we do see a total shift in the species in some areas within the zone. So I think probably they will remain as reserves of some kind. Across the border, you have in Belarus, you have a radiation reserve, which is what it's called, and it's at least as much as is in the Ukraine. So it's really a huge area, and I think possibly, or certainly this is being mooted in somewhere like in the Koreas. You have the DMZ, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. So it's no man's land. It is full of mines, and sort of booby traps and things like that. But again, within that area, because there's been a stalemate for so long, we do see a return of lots of different species, and a lot of migratory birds use that in a very built up region of the world. And I think there is a lot of talk, although North Korea has not yet agreed to it, that perhaps even if there should be, an end to the war between them, that area could be kept as some kind of nature reserve in some way. And I think that's a beautiful idea.
Yes. Wong asked, they binge watched abandoned places exploration videos when the pandemic started. I think we can all relate to binge watching when the pandemic started. It's not an exact science, since every place is different, but how much time would you say it takes for a place to reach kind of that uncanny valley of abandoned, start to reach that kind of ruined look?
That's a great question. And I think it depends a lot on where you are in the world. In humid, warm places, it happens really fast. So you get that sense of, climbers and creeper plants climbing over stuff really, really quickly. And then that that does definitely have that big like change in the way that place feels, because you feel the vegetation around and all of that kind of thing, and you get a little creepy crawlies. So the warmer and sort of more humid a place, the faster that happens. But if it's very, so that, you know, yeah, literally 2 or 3 years, 10 years, it would look very different. And then if you're in somewhere that's very cold, in, for example, tundra, or if you're somewhere that's very hot and dry, these places can be almost like time capsules. If you've been watching all these videos, you're probably aware already of Kolmanskop, which was a former diamond mining place in Namibia, and that's in the desert. And all the rooms in these houses are sort of full of sand dunes, and it's really beautiful. And it's because it's so dry, you know, it just sucks all of the moisture out, and these places are preserved very well. So yeah, it's a real mix. But I think that mainly the places that I was looking at would be, I think a kind of sweet spot was after, say, the 1940s, so after the Second World War, and then maybe up to 10 to 20 years ago, depending on the site.
Sure. Did you have a favorite place that you visited? Is there anywhere you would like to return to someday?
I haven't actually spoken about Montserrat, but Montserrat is an island in the Caribbean, and it is a British territory, and it was affected by volcanic eruptions all the way through the late 90s and early noughties, and to some extent into the present, although it's been quite a long time since there's been eruption. And what's happened in Montserrat is it's this very beautiful, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful and tiny, and lovely, rainforested tropical island, with beautiful beaches. And it had this lovely town, like the main port was called Plymouth, and it had some quite nice, it was very small, but it had some quite nice colonial architecture and a big harbor. But the main town was right in the path of some of these, they're called pyroclastic flows. So it's the kind of eruption that affected Pompeii. So it's, rather than lava, it's like superheated ash and dust, and it all comes down in this extremely hot flow, and it goes out into the sea, and what it looks like afterwards is sort of like a mudslide. But it's now, over a course of many eruptions, it's sort of covered at least 2 stories, and in some places kind of even deeper than that, right in the center of the city. So it has these grown over suburbs, which are full of like jungle plants. Sometimes things like bat colonies. I found a bat colony like hanging from a fan in the middle of one of the old churches. So I went inside, and there's like shaft of amber light coming through the cross-shaped window, and then all these bats climbing over each other in the center of the room. It was really something. And I think it was a combination of it was like being in a movie, you know, the scale of the damage there. You know, it was a center of a town, and then all of these sort of suburbs going out either side. And then also just because it was just such a wonderful place to be. It was such a friendly place, and you know, the people who had stayed on the island, many of them chose to leave, but people who had stayed on the island had to start again. And what they'd done was often keep the names of businesses from the main town and just start the business somewhere else, you know. So they were all spread out. And so there was a place called the Loft, which was a cafe, and it wasn't in a loft, but they didn't want to give up the name, you know, so that kind of thing. And I don't know, it was friendly, super safe place to be. Lots of people were out, you know, hitchhiking, and you just pick each other up and drop people off, and start up conversations with complete strangers. So that was a wonderful place.
Sounds beautiful. Oh, I know, Cal, this might be a good moment to, I know you have some images of some of the places you visited. Would you like to share those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, bear with me just for a second. I'll just run through them quite quickly. Share screen. Is that going to work? Yeah, here we are. Okay. Now let me know if this is Can you see this?
Yes. Yep, I can see
Okay,
it.
great. So I mentioned the ship graveyard in Newark Harbor. So this is actually in a waterway just off Newark Harbor, called the Arthur Kill. So I took a drone down there at dawn just to get some footage. Very eerie and evocative place, and you'll see that there are sort of areas of built up sections quite close to this, so it's sort of an area of abandonment right in the middle of the city. These are some images from the Bings that I discussed earlier, which are in West Lothian, Scotland. So these are post-industrial sites. They're big mountains of shale, so like gravelly bits which were processed to produce shale oil in the 19th century. So actually these are probably the oldest sites, because a lot of these have been regenerated since the sort of mid 19th century. These are the product of the shale mining industry, and you can see here how the silver birch grow through this completely sterile gravel environment. I've got quite a lot of pictures from Chernobyl. This was from a high school in Chernobyl. This is the local swimming pool in Chernobyl. A cafe with a very beautiful window. This is called the Cafe Pripyat. And this is inside the apartment blocks in Chernobyl. So in theory, you're not really meant to go inside buildings, but I found in practice that they had a very lax attitude towards health and safety, and lots of people were going in and out and taking photos and so on. So I thought, well, fine, I will too. And this is where some of the trains have fallen off the track. Now, I met this man in Chernobyl in one of the smaller villages called Parashiv. He and his late wife and their children moved back to the village that they had been evacuated from, because essentially they couldn't really adapt to life outside of Chernobyl. They were farmers. They were given a high-rise building in Ukraine, in Kiev, sorry, and simply couldn't really adapt. They decided to take their chances within the zone themselves. And he's a number of several dozen so-called Samosli or self-settlers who have done this. Basically, they broke back into their old houses. And after a certain amount of time, the Ukrainian authorities decided just to allow them to be. They're mainly very elderly, like Ivan. So he's there, and actually people will come and they'll drop off medicine or they'll drop off his pension. This is inside Chernobyl, mainly in Pripyat town, and this is one of the sports halls there, in the same building. Just to give you a sense, I suppose, of the scale, you know, as I say, you know, more than 200 villages were abandoned. It's not just one town, although the town itself is really quite incredible. This is taken in Cyprus. I went to look at what's called the Green Line there, which is the no man's land that cuts Cyprus in half. It goes from east to west, between North Cyprus, which is sort of Turkish occupied, and the Republic of Cyprus, which is sort of Greek allied in the south. And so there's quite a large area. This is actually inside a Turkish military zone, this particular building. So it has not been resettled since the civil war there, and you can see how sort of succulents and various plants take over these buildings. They do have, you know, hundreds of kilometers of fencing. Some areas are looser than others, and I do know that there is a sort of small culture of people who will break in. It's quite dangerous because in theory the Turkish troops are, you know, they carry guns around with you. But I did speak to one man who had been inside. This area here particularly is quite famous. It's a stretch of coastline where it had been a very sort of wealthy, it's called Varosha. It had been a wealthy sort of holiday making area, and that has been Turkish occupied or held behind Turkish lines for decades now. And they are sort of high rise hotel buildings in the main, but also some apartment blocks. And it's a complete time capsule inside. This is in Detroit. To access some areas, I went out with the Humane Society looking for street dogs. So Elise and Dave were great company, and they took me inside some of the old factory buildings. It was, I don't know, I suppose Detroit is such a mixed city. So some areas are like this, but also, you know, it wasn't an extremely friendly city. I really enjoyed being in Detroit. This is in a former Catholic school. So really what's happened is just around half the population of Detroit left. And so there are too many buildings and a lot now, really, not a majority of buildings, but really large amounts of houses and other buildings have been taken down in recent years to try and, I suppose, head off what I was talking about earlier, what they call locally blight. So buildings like this, and that's Dave from the Humane Society. And this is in Estonia. I'll just zip through quite quickly. So these are old agricultural buildings. I went there to talk about abandoned farmland and the carbon sinking prospects of these places. So in Estonia and across a lot of the former Soviet Union, we have huge amounts of forest regrowth on a massive scale. And we do find that across North America, you know, particularly United States, but that's sort of an older forest now, which is now mature. But also these days we find a lot in post-Soviet, in Eastern and Central Europe. There's a lot of forestry growth, and also in East Asia. These are former fortress islands in Scotland, where I open. This one is not my image, but the rest of them are my images. And this is in Montserrat in the Caribbean, just what we were discussing a minute ago. That's a former hotel. And you can see how, so what's filled the swimming pool here is volcanic ash, and then the vegetation grows on top. So you can get a sense of, you know, how quickly things in a tropical climate, things can change. So these houses are completely grown through. This again was taken with my drone. So you can see these are some of the outlying suburbs of the town, and some enormous boulder that's sort of flowing down into the city. So these houses are particularly difficult to reach now because the road access has now been cut off by the volcano. This is Wheeler, who took me into some ruins inside Paterson, New Jersey. There's me. And then these are sort of dead fish on the shore of the Salton Sea, and this is Slab City. So this is a slightly different sort of ecosystem and sort of system of people. Okay, I think that will do us for now.
Well, thank you for sharing those with us. We have a few more questions in the chat. One is, have you ever visited Swan Island in Maine? It was abandoned in the 1940s. People can visit their amazing homes and remaining flora and fauna.
I have not personally, but I have heard of it and would like to. Yes. I see also someone commented, there's a great documentary about the babushkas of Chernobyl. I absolutely agree. This is an amazing documentary, and it's all about these self-settlers, these mostly particularly elderly women, and the sort of culture. So if you are interested in these people who broke back into living in their old houses in sort of rural Chernobyl, I do really recommend that documentary. It's amazing.
Excellent. Let's see, Teresa would like to know, what was the most surprising thing you learned in your research for this book?
The thing I was most enchanted by was from that chapter about France, the metal tolerant plants, because I just found them so incredible. It sounds boring, but when you go into it, it's amazing. So these, especially the hyper accumulating plants, so these are the ones that like suck the metal from the ground and they store it in them. So like there's one species of tree in New Caledonia that when you cut it, it bleeds a kind of latex which has so much nickel in it. It's turquoise. I mean, it looks like paint. It's amazing. And I think it's something like 20+% nickel in this sap, so it's amazing. And then there's a new area of science now, which is to do with, I suppose, phytoremediation, which is using plants to like improve polluted landscapes, but also the question of, can you take it further and do phytomining, which is when you use these plants to suck up metals, especially heavy metals, polluting grounds, and then dry them out and burn them and then harvest these metals. You know, like, it's just cool. I don't know. It was like magic, you know, plant magic. So I was obsessed with those. So that's all in my chapter about the Zone Rouge in France.
Yes, that sounds fascinating. Never thought about that. KW would like to know, have you visited or covered any of the abandoned Olympic stadiums around the world?
No, I haven't. I suspect they would be best for photographers. Um, I suppose I could talk about in some places I talked about sort of like the death of modernism and like how modern architecture had all of these like ambitions for like social ambitions, and how the like ruination of all those like 20th century buildings is kind of a symbol for how like we tried and failed to change human nature by building them different buildings to be in. And I suppose that has something in common with these sort of Olympic dreams, right? But no, the short answer is no, but I think that they would make some incredible images, and I've seen a few along those lines.
Yes. Juan would like to know, did you get to see any of the feral yet friendly dogs left behind in Chernobyl?
Yes, yeah, the dogs are everywhere and are a delight. You know, you would think that they would be quite frightening because they are in like big gangs. But Ludmilla, who was the translator that I was there with, she feeds them. And I think quite a few of the other guides and drivers and so on who come in and out, and also the people who still work in the decommissioning the nuclear plant, of which there are actually quite a lot. So certain areas of the zone are still quite peopled, because it takes decades to decommission a nuclear plant. So a lot of them feed the dogs. The dogs are kind of friendly. They hang out. They're not really pets, but they are. The ones that I saw were in pretty good nick and quite liked a gentle pat on the head, although you wouldn't want to get too close.
Excellent. I wanted to ask, I know we talked a bit before the start of the Zoom, but it must be pretty interesting releasing a book in the midst of a global pandemic. And do you think, especially, you know, your book, it almost feels especially timely now that we've almost all had some more practice with solitude than we did before. And I also remember early in the pandemic, all these kind of news stories or interest in often like over exaggerated interest in animals kind of moving back into places that people weren't going in such frequent numbers anymore. So that all must have been quite interesting when you released your book.
Yeah, I mean, it was very lucky. I mean, just from a writing point of view, that I had essentially finished all of the research trips and actually had just finished the writing when this all kicked off. Because I know a lot of writers who've been doing sort of travel intensive work that obviously haven't been able to make that work. So that was very lucky, just in terms of timing. And I suppose, yeah, like while I was working on the sort of redrafts, I was making some changes between having handed in the book and its sort of final version. That's when, yeah, those stories you alluded to there of things like goats taking over towns in Wales, or you know, like mountain lions appearing in Santiago, and all sorts of stories like this popped up. Those dolphins that turned out not actually to be reinvading Venice. Those stories were all around, and I was sort of worried that people would maybe be fed up of this whole narrative by the time it came out. But I think what those examples showed, you know, I was very skeptical of them from the off because I knew how long these reclamations take, right? So it was just too fast. You know, these were not things taking over ground that they didn't already in some way know. You wouldn't, animals don't do that in the space of weeks. But what it indicated to me was the fact that essentially our land was already, we're already coexisting with a lot of these species, you know, and if it just took us paying more attention or being quieter or just withdrawing for slightly longer during the day for them to make themselves seen, it made us understand how many other species are living among us almost all the time. So take the mountain lions in Santiago for an example. You know, like they do often have these animals sort of lurking on the edges of towns. And so they were slightly bolder, slightly braver, but it wasn't something that they aren't already doing. And so I think it just brought home to a lot of us how we do already coexist with other species, and how quickly, if these places were to be truly abandoned, how quickly they would begin to start, making them their territory again.
Excellent. Yes. I know also in the book you kind of, it offers a lot of hope seeing different species kind of rebound in these places, but you don't let us entirely off the hook. There's a lot of hard facts here too. How do you think we should try and balance hope and kind of pessimism when we're approaching the human impact on our environment?
Yeah, I think it's very important to be right. Two things here, which was one of them was I was very consciously looking for hope, I think, because I do feel that certainly if you're of a similar temperament to me, and you are concerned about the environment today, it can be very easy to feel like everything is lost and there's no point in continuing, and there's no point in trying to improve anything because it's already too late. And so, like, for me, I think it's very important to find motivation by realizing that we can make a difference. It's not too late, and that there are all of these natural processes already constantly in motion that could help us, especially in things like forestry growth. The carbon sink taking place on abandoned land is on an incredible scale. It's not enough to mean that our carbon emissions don't matter, not at all. But if we stopped, emitting carbon tomorrow, then there is a process by which some of that could be sort of taken down. So it made me feel a little bit like the world was there to help us if we were there to help it. And I think the other thing was I did feel, you have to balance this throughout with that sense of, that doesn't mean that everything's okay. You have to be responsible when looking for silver linings. You have to not let everyone off the hook. So I guess that to me, finding that balance was important. I hope that I found that balance, and people can both take hope, but also feel somewhat chastened at the challenges ahead, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. And everyone, I've placed a link to purchase Cal's book at Wellesley Books. You can click that if you are interested in reading more. It is a great book. I've been listening to the audiobook, which you read, right, Cal?
Yes. Yeah.
Was that a new experience?
I had done it once before. So this is my second book, and I read the other one. I think because if you're writing the first person, they like it to be your own voice if you can do it. So I have to say, spending like 3.5 days in a room with just my own voice is quite an intense experience. But yeah, it's done, and I must add that the recording itself is not 3.5 days, but it takes a lot longer to record than the finished product.
Yes. Excellent. Yes, it's you did a lovely job. It's a pleasure to listen to as well. KW in the chat says, I love when authors read their own books, and I agree.
Yeah, it was kind of nice actually. You sort of you re-meet yourself in a strange way, and also because it can be quite a long time between you handing in like the finished version of a book and it appearing. And so the recording happened somewhere in between. So I'd sort of refresh my memory of it all by reading it, cover to cover, not long before the book came out. So that was actually a great exercise that even if I wasn't going to record an audiobook, I think I should do anyway,
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning here, this afternoon for you in Scotland. I will also be sending out an email to all our participants today with a link where you can purchase Cal's book, just a follow-up email. So thank you all for joining us this morning, and thank you again, Cal.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming along. It's really good of you to give up your time, so thank you.